This narrow, peaceful beach could be anywhere in Australia. But it's not. It's 16,000 kilometres away here in Turkey, at Anzac Cove on the Gallipoli Peninsula. And I've come here with hundreds of other Australians to pay my respects to the men and women of Anzac. The last survivors who have returned to remember their mates whose graves surround them on this barren peninsula.
This is for all of us here and for all of our fellow Australians at home an honour, an experience, an emotion which goes beyond all words. But these men here, they know the truth of Gallipoli. They would be the last to claim that they were heroes, but indeed they were.
Few Australians here with me would disagree with their Prime Minister. Through school, I'd learned of the exploits of the Anzacs, the landing and the great battles, and I'd heard stories about my great-uncle Joe, who died at Gallipoli. This painting at the Australian War Memorial is seen by thousands of tourists each year, and it graphically portrays the tragic charge of the Australian Light Horse at the Neck on the 7th of August, 1915. When the artist George Lambert visited this place in 1919 with Australia's official war historian Charles Bean, they walked across that tiny battlefield, less than 3 tennis courts in size, and they found the bones of soldiers, grim reminders of the 300 Australians who died charging the enemy. But a far worse enemy than the Turks was hunger, lack of sanitation, and disease. And the story of one soldier in particular brought this home to me. This plaque bears the name of Jim Martin. He was a member of the Australian Infantry Battalion, the 21st Battalion. And the plaque is here at Lone Pine Memorial, overlooking Anzac Cove. Private Jim Martin landed on the beach behind me, the beach called Anzac Cove on the Gallipoli Peninsula. Jim was immediately involved in action at Courtney's Post. But 3 weeks later, he became sick and was transferred to the hospital ships, which would have been anchored around about this point. And all that we know of what transpired after his arrival on the hospital ship is contained in a letter which was written by the matron of the Glenart Castle ship.
Dear Mrs. Martin, before this letter reaches you, you will already have heard of the very sad loss in the death of your son. I thought you might like a few words from me, as I was with him for the very short time he was in the hospital boat. He was brought on board from the shore yesterday at 5 p.m. in a very collapsed state. We got him to bed comfortably and did everything possible for him. He said he was feeling much more comfortable and thanked me so nicely for what had been done for him. He then settled down to get a sleep, but died quite suddenly and quietly after heart failure at 6:40 p.m. He will be buried at sea.
Jim Martin was only 14 when he died, and his name is on the Roll of Honour at the Australian War Memorial in Canberra. He is one of 8,709 soldiers who died at Gallipoli. But the Roll of Honour seems to stretch forever. What happened to the other 50,000 soldiers whose names are on this wall? As a young boy growing up on a soldier settlement block here in Western Victoria, I never realised that part of the answer to that question was at this place, Passchendaele. Today, farmers and tourists travel this quiet country road, and few would realise why this place is called Passchendaele. But in the 1920s, it meant a lot to the locals. They named this settlement after a town in which their sons had fought in Western Europe during World War I. They didn't know exactly where their boys were. They merely referred to the fact that they were somewhere in France. This beautiful, peaceful countryside is northern France today. And this little village could be Coleraine in Victoria or somewhere along the Murray River. But it was here many summers ago that one father wrote about his son.
He fell to a stray shell while leading out his patrol on a quiet sector on a beautiful summer's evening.
This boy was only one of millions of men who died. Men from Germany, France, England and her empire. Men from Australia. One of the war poets that I studied whilst I was at school wrote these words.
Here was the world's worst wound, a grave as big as Europe.
And today, their gravestones are everywhere. I was shocked when I first saw them. Hundreds of graveyards, countless headstones, huge memorials, pieces of silent stone, grim reminders of the tragedies of the past. Like the father who wrote about his son, most Australians after the war couldn't afford to visit the final resting places of Bill, George or Stan. But today their relatives are making the pilgrimage that Grandma and Grandpa could not. Age 22, Ronald Ewan O'Brien.
My grandmother's brother.
The great tragedy of Uncle Rolly is that he was one of the original Anzacs. He was a rush to enlist boy who landed at Gallipoli on the 25th of April and then unfortunately died 3 years to that night in the retaking of Villers-Bretonneux. And I put this here for my grandma and all the family.
My father-in-law, Albert Edward Kemp, was killed in 1917, September 1917, at Glencorse Wood during the Third Battle of Ypres, but no body was ever found. And so his name is on the Menin Gate. He was in the 6th Battalion, and I was able to find his name fairly easily because I knew that. He left a young family, the youngest of his children being my late husband. And I felt that they would like me to leave some flowers there.
Back home in Australia, every country town and suburb remembered their dead. There is no town without a memorial in the main street or the park. And at Kiama, a little town south of Sydney, where the tourists come for sun and surf, they pass by this memorial without even a thought. On this memorial are two names, the names of the Farquharson brothers. This is Walter. Like many others, Walter marched off to war to the sound of brass bands. All he left behind was a photo on a mantelpiece. About 3 years ago, I was doing some research in Kiama, and I found out that Walter is still remembered by the town. In the Methodist Church, there is a memorial to him and his brother Frank. When the townsfolk erected the memorial, they had no idea how long the war would last. I also discovered that Walter was being studied by local high school students. And they found out that he was just like them. They saw photos of Walter with his family, Walter lair-rising with his mates, Walter surfing. They also discovered the house in which he lived. Try to imagine what it would have been like in May 1917 when a telegram arrived. A telegram which said, "Walter's missing." That horrible phrase, "missing in action." It must have been awful receiving this sort of news, not knowing the fate of your son. But this was an experience that was shared by many thousands of Australian families during World War I. And of course they were anxious to find out more. And one of the things that they could do was to write to the Red Cross Wounded and Missing Inquiry Bureau. And here at the Australian War Memorial, there are some 500 of the Bureau's boxes. And in boxes such as this, you will find some 30,000 individual case studies. One of the case studies is about Walter Farquharson. And in Walter's file, I found a letter written by Sergeant Whittaker describing the death of his mate.
About 9 o'clock that night, we had decided to evacuate the position. The men went back as well as the wounded, and Sergeant Farquharson, Sergeant Massey and myself stopped back and held the position till the rest had arrived back safely to our own lines. The Germans were shelling heavily and also firing at us with a machine gun. The last I saw of them both was when they were going over a slight rise in an area where the shells were peppering fairly hard. I think they must have been caught with the shells. One body was found, and it is possible that the missing man was buried or damaged so much that he could not be recognised. If a shell happened to fall on a man, it is difficult to tell who it is and sometimes to find any remains at all.
Why were these Australians fighting a war half a world away? Why were they at this cold, miserable place, the town of Ypres in western Belgium? Few Australians today remember what happened here, but the people of Ypres have not forgotten. Every night the traffic is stopped and the buglers play the last post, and the haunting sounds of the past reverberate through this massive structure. "70 years ago, Germany struck at France through Belgium, and because Britain had guaranteed Belgium's neutrality, she went to war. And so too did Australia. By 1915, Ypres was the last town Britain held and had to be defended at all cost. In 1917, virtually all of Australia's infantry forces, some 60 battalions, marched out through the Menin Gate to do battle in the Flanders countryside.
All the Australians that went up to the battlefield from behind the lines, they have passed this particular spot. And there was even a saying going around of those boys that passed the gate that let the last one to pass the gate close the door. And unfortunately, we have to say that many of those boys that passed this gate lost their lives on the battlefields of the Passchendaele Ridge between Broodseinde and Passchendaele during that famous battle.
The Anzacs hated Ypres. They wanted to get home. Our official war photographer, Frank Hurley, captured the hell that was Ypres. He too experienced the mud, chaos and death of the Western Front.
I pushed up the duckboard track to a blockhouse, a mound of powdered brick, from where there is a magnificent panorama of the battlefield. The way was gruesome and awful beyond words. The ground had been heavily shelled and the dead and wounded lay about everywhere. The rain had made this ground a quagmire, through which the wounded had to drag themselves, and those mortally wounded passed out their young lives.
In just 2.5 months in 1917, over 8,000 Australians and hundreds of thousands of British Empire troops died trying to break through the enemy lines. But the Germans too had courage and endurance. All we gained was a few kilometres, which was later retaken by the Germans near the little town of Passchendaele. Thousands of soldiers are buried at this cemetery at Tyne Cot near Passchendaele. When I was here, it was freezing, and the headstones seemed to stretch forever, row upon row, some 10,000 in all. Every cemetery has a cross. But this one at Tyne Cot is particularly significant. Beneath it is a concrete pillbox or blockhouse. And it was from the safety of this box that German machine gunners mowed down the advancing Australians. But in October 1917, the Australians broke through and captured the pillbox. It was then turned into a first aid post. Those soldiers who didn't pull through, both Germans and Australians, are buried here, side by side. Many of the gravestones are for soldiers who were brought here to be buried after the war. They now rest in beautifully manicured, neat, ordered rows. Many of their names remain, but others who were never identified are known unto God. A rare few are remembered in death as heroes. One of these heroes was Victoria Cross winner Captain Clarence Smith Jeffries. And on a cold and wet October day in 1917, he was killed leading his men, charging the pillbox at Tyne Cot. Jeffries is one of 53 Australians who won the Victoria Cross for gallantry and bravery at the Western Front. Standing in this graveyard, you get the feeling that thousands of others equally deserve this recognition. Jeffries was only 23 when he died.
And I see by a gravestone you're only 19 when you joined the glorious fallen in 1916. Well, I hope he died quick, and I hope
But they were all young. How do we imagine what it was like? How can we understand the impact that the savage experience of battle had on these boys?
The savage experience began 48 hours in advance. The soldiers are told 48 hours in advance, so they don't have too long to think about the details and what lies ahead. First thing they do is to write out their will, and second, to write a final letter to their parents, which is left behind in the battalion orderly room. If they don't come back, if they're killed, the letter will be sent home. If they do come back, the letter will be destroyed. They then go away to sleep, and all soldiers, without exception, remember that on that particular night, nobody sleeps a wink. They're working about the odds. They're remembering particular vignettes of the battlefield, of seeing bodies blasted apart and bayonetings and so forth. Next day, they prepare for battle, battle order, leaving their pack behind, picking up grenades, odd rolls of barbed wire, everything that may be needed. They march up, arrive at the front line the evening before battle. They arrive at night, so German aeroplanes won't spot them and the artillery won't be attracted. They arrive on the front line the night before, and again there's a second night in which they don't sleep at all. So any men attacking in battle in the First World War have been without sleep for 2 nights running. They're exhausted. Battles, almost all battles on the West Front, start at dawn, usually about 4:30 in the morning, just before first light. The whistle blows, the officer blows his whistle, the men advance. First thing they notice is the huge volume of sound. They can feel the disturbance of air as this great curtain of shells passes over. It's a volume of sound so severe that people on the higher points in London, about 200 kilometres away, can hear these barrages. And in the background, what interests them more particularly is a sound like escaping steam, which is the machine gun barrage of the Germans. That's always the great attack stopper. They advance further, they run into German barbed wire. And that's barbed wire so formidable that it's used by farmers even today, 3 generations later. The barb's as thick as a man's thumb. If they manage to get through that without being impaled in it or machine gunned, then they hit the German trenches, and the fighting is hand to hand, thrusting with a bayonet. The sound would be just like a slaughterhouse. The men aren't talking, they're grunting. If they hear themselves, as the poet Siegfried Sassoon mentioned, the sound is just like pigs grunting. They attack savagely, and if there's any doubt, the bayonets will be thrown away. They'll fight with their bare hands and fighting with their boots. The impact is severe, that within an hour both sides are exhausted, and the battle will then stop. Both sides will disengage, aeroplanes will be sent up to find where the front line is, and for 3-4 hours perhaps there's a period of delay And what the attackers will then do, they'll slowly wind down, and the winding down is what Charles Bean called ratting, which means hunting out the Germans, smoking them out of the dugouts, and bayoneting or shooting the Germans as they emerge. It's only, say, after an hour of ratting that they begin to calm down and prisoners might then be taken. Men who've been through battle 3 or 4 times remain middle-aged. It's what people notice, even Hurley, Dyson, even the war artists, when they went home, the first thing people noticed was they looked very much older.
Eric Tate was a young volunteer from Kangaroo Valley, New South Wales. Like Walter Farquharson, he proudly marched away to serve his country. This photo was on his mother's mantelpiece in 1915. 2 years later, this photo was taken behind the lines. It shows an aged man. What had Eric seen? What had he done in a war of bayonets, machine guns, barbed wire, and poisonous gas? Eric was blown to pieces near Passchendaele, and like thousands of other soldiers, he has no known grave. The Menin Gate was built for young men like Eric. Here visitors cannot wander through long lines of graves and carefully attended flower beds. All they can do is to look up at the endless list of names, some 56,000 in all. Eric Tate's name is one of them. Most memorials at home will have at least one name that is on the Menin Gate. When it was opened in 1927, a lone piper played "The Flowers of the Forest." One soldier wrote,
But they are troops that fade, not flowers for poets' tearful fooling, men, gaps for filling, losses who might have fought longer.
You wouldn't expect children in Australia today to know about the effects of the Great War. But in faraway Europe, these French children do. In 1918, their school was the front line, and their town, Villers-Bretonneux, was in ruins. In April 1918, the Germans had driven the Allies from the town, and on the 24th of April, almost 3 years to the day since the landing at Anzac Cove, Gallipoli, the Australians attacked at Villers-Bretonneux. By dusk on Anzac Day 1918, the town once more belonged to its French inhabitants. Like the people of Ypres, they too have not forgotten the Australians. If you ever visit this town, you'll find that you are very welcome here. And we didn't forget them either. We helped rebuild the school and other parts of the town. And it's here at Villers-Bretonneux, not at Beaucourt, not at Passchendaele, that you will find the Australian National War Memorial.
Il est très important, nous savons qu'il est très important pour les Australiens d'abord, parce que c'est un haut lieu, c'est un endroit très émouvant pour eux, c'est plus qu'un monument, c'est un symbole pour eux, c'est le symbole de leur présence ici et du sacrifice qu'ils ont consenti ici, en France, pendant la Première Guerre mondiale. Et pour nous, c'est ce mémorial qui fait partie de notre environnement, qui fait partie de notre paysage. Pour nous, ce mémorial, c'est l'Australie aussi, et c'est le souvenir que nous avons des Australiens, ou que nous avons, mais aussi que nous entretenons au fond de notre mémoire, dans notre histoire.
Every Anzac Day at dawn, the school children come here to remember men from strange places. Men from Kangaroo Valley, Warrnambool, Kiama. Of all the battlefields on the Western Front, none reveals the horror and slaughter of the war more than Beaumont Hamel. Here, a bronze caribou looks out over the trenches, where in July 1916, at the start of the Somme battle, the 1st Newfoundland Battalion charged the enemy lines. A Scottish soldier saw them die.
On came the Newfoundlanders, a great body of men. But the fire intensified and they were wiped out in front of my eyes. I cursed the generals for their useless slaughter. They seemed to have no idea what was going on.
Like the Australians, these men were volunteers too, and they made up the only battalion which was sent by this small island off the Canadian coast. Try to imagine the impact of the news back in Newfoundland. In 40 minutes, 640 of their sons had been killed or wounded. Although Australians didn't fight here, Beaumont Hamel gives us some feeling of what the terrain and conditions were like. Here visitors can walk amongst the trenches. Here they can see where the enemy was positioned.
You get some impression, I guess.
Beaumont Hamel helps us realise the incredible impact of war on other countries as well. And the lines of the poem Beneath the Caribou speak for themselves.
For not 1 foot of this dank sod but drank its surfeit of the blood of gallant men.
Since 1918, wars have come and gone, and millions have died. When we want to remember war, Australians remember Anzac. Even today, we still return to the shores of Gallipoli to pay our respects to the last survivors and their fallen comrades. I grew up with the legend of Gallipoli, but it's only in recent years that I've come to realise that Australia's worst wound was, and remains, the Western Front. The graveyards and memorials on the Somme tell part of this horrific story. A story of men like Eric Tate, Clarence Jeffries, and Walter Farquharson. However, I now realise that the clues to a much bigger part of that story were around me here all the time, at this place, Passchendaele in Western Victoria.
Well, the suffering, the sorrow, the glory, the shame, the killing, the dying, it were all done in vain. For Willie McBride, it's all happened again. And again and again and again and again. Did they beat the drum slowly? Did they sound the fife lowly? Did the rifles fire o'er ye as they lowered ye down? Did the bugle sing the last post in chorus? Did the pipe play the flute